One of the problems in the whole relationship between Britain and Ireland was that, I mean, it had been marked by centuries of bitterness and conflict and hatred. And, the relationship between the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom and the British government, I mean, they were historically pretty bad, right? for very obvious reasons. And I think, and this was the importance, I think, of our own relationship in this, I think you did have a new generation in the Republic, in the UK, obviously. We both had these election victories that, in a sense, were the harbingers of a new set of attitudes. Really important, we were both in Europe. And in the European Union, we often cooperated together, worked together. And therefore, the external context for the conflict was kind of, it was softening all of these traditional and historical differences. And we were starting to think of ourselves, the Irish and the British, of having things that we could do in common together. So outside, never mind the peace process in Northern Ireland, in the broader context of the island of Ireland and Britain, there was a different sense and a different attitude. And that created a context in which, even if those people internal to the process were still pretty much locked in their traditional positions, you and I were both in the situation of saying, look, we're about to enter a new millennium. There's going to be a completely different world out there. We're partners in Europe. We've got a massive amount of things in common. We could do fantastic business and trade with each other. Come on, there's got to be a different way forward. And that I think was, in the end, an important part of the impetus for a final agreement, because over time, I think that also influenced the people inside the Northern Ireland cauldron of politics.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose let's move it on then to that March, St. Patrick's Day. I did a traditional visit, and I briefed our colleague and a friend, Bill, and I told him that George Mitchell had consulted you and I about setting a final date, and that he had reckoned he had listened to everything very patiently and very committed to the process. But he wanted to get back to his wife and young child, back to Heather, and I think his child was about 6 months old then. So he set that date. So we came back then 20th of March or so, and then all of a sudden we only had about 30 days to go, Tony, and nothing really agreed. But we had that great mantra. Nothing agreed till everything is agreed, which was a great line that we used. But that starting that few weeks, of course, as you just said a few minutes ago, nobody thought we were going to be successful, and that was really the Belfast Telegraph poll, which said 5% believed that we would get success. So that was kind of a bad poll rating. And that was only about 2 weeks out. Really, we had a deadline. George had set a deadline. We had gone along with it. The parties had gone along with it too, which was George went to all the parties. So it wasn't just him. He said, listen, this is it. I have to go home. And so here we go. So you and I were faced with a tighter deadline than I think we had expected, but that was it. We had to go through it. So can your recollections of that few weeks, Tony, in whatever order you want to take them?
Yeah, no, it was a strange time, because there was this negotiation going on. George Mitchell was talking with all the parties, and I was getting reports, every day of what was happening. And the reports were pretty downbeat most of the time. But then there were thoughts, well, at least there's an outline agreement that's going to be put to the parties. And there was always a debate as to, a lot of people around me said, look, you're a new prime minister, you've got a whole lot of domestic agenda items here. Just be careful you don't go put your whole premiership on the line for this Northern Ireland agreement that looks pretty distant to us, okay? Because the vibes that are coming out are not great. And so in the run up to actually coming to Northern Ireland to, inverted commas, rescue the process, there was quite an internal debate amongst my own folk, not because people didn't believe in the importance of the process, but just because they frankly thought it just doesn't look as if it can succeed. And it's one of the interesting reflections I have sometimes, that if I'd been longer in government and known how much can go wrong in government, I might have been not so naive to think that you could go to Belfast and rescue the thing. I might just have thought, no, it's never going to happen. But it's so in the end, well, as you know, I and you and I spoke at the time. I thought, come on, let's go and give this one last shot.
You think of the size of the issues, and I talk now Northern Ireland, they have their problems, but they're minor compared to like prisoners, decommissioning, the fundamental reform of the policing, the change of the criminal justice system, demilitarisation, which you successfully carried out, which was difficult. There were enormous issues as we went into that last week, Tony.
Yeah, there were huge issues. There were issues of long-standing disagreement and grievance on both sides. And they were to resolve them. And this was the important thing, really, about the whole process. To resolve them, the parties had to escape their comfort zone, because their comfort zone was, I mean, indulgence is not the right word but they sat within that comfort zone very comfortably. In other words, the notion of releasing people from prison who'd committed serious criminal offences and murdered people, the idea that you change the police force, the notion that you ended up with an actual structured engagement with the Republic of Ireland. I mean, these things were all fantastically difficult for the Unionists, for the Republicans and the Nationalists. A lot of it depended on trust with the British government, and trust was in very short supply. It required a big leap of imagination and determination. And this is where, in the end, I always say to people about a peace process, you're never going to get a peace process that succeeds unless you get really imaginative leadership amongst the parties that are engaged in the struggle. Because the easiest thing for them to do is to stay in their comfort zone. And the hardest thing for them to do is to exit it, because you don't know then what the result may be. And, one of the things that Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness used to say to me during the course of this, they'd say, look, if you end up doing a bad job for the Labour Party and they're just going to be angry at you, if we end up doing what our guys consider a bad job, we're dead. So it's and many other people will die along with us. So it's this is an issue of huge sensitivity. And David Trimble would say, if we lose this, if I misjudge the moment to take the unionist community to a new place, this situation is not going to be, you're not going to return to the status quo before the negotiations. It's going to be even worse, because you'll have had this failure to reach agreement. So this was what made it difficult. And I think what happened with the process in the end was two things. I think there were a set of principles that did make sense at the heart of the agreement, number one. And number two, I think we were lucky in one sense that the nature of this negotiation, putting everyone together in what became, as you know, a kind of very high profile, high risk, high gain setting, it in the end, it almost tipped people out of their comfort zone, just because they thought, well, otherwise we're going to spend several days here with just a monumental failure on our hands.
So, Tony, those last few days, I mean, you stayed up all night, I stayed up all night. we were in touch with President Clinton. You know, we were back and forward with the parties. I mean, if in negotiations are intense, I mean, there could not have been anything more intense than that Tuesday to Friday. I mean, it was extraordinary, and you know, your own memories of that. I mean, I don't think either of us got too many hours sleep, if we got any, I think.
Yeah, no, we were in that. I was saying earlier that we negotiated in some nice places, but Castle Buildings wasn't one of them, and we were locked up in that place for what seemed days and days. I mean, Bertie, at this point, I do want to say, you know, your own role in this was incredibly important. I mean, because if I'd been interacting with a Taoiseach, an Irish Prime Minister, that was either not fully committed or was not prepared to really push the boundaries, I don't think we would have got through those days, because you were working the Republican nationalist side the whole time. I was trying to work the unionist side. You were then in several meetings with me, and I remember, you know, you were absorbing a fair amount of impoliteness, frankly, from some of the parties, as indeed I was. But, you know, I felt for you at points in the course of it, but you took it all in a you know, a very relaxed way, and we just kept at it. Now, the principles that we were talking about were very important. So you had the principle of consent. Okay, that's what the unionists always wanted. That was their that was the thing that they really needed in the negotiation. And then on the other side of the scales, to balance that, you had the fair treatment of the nationalist Catholic community in Northern Ireland. You had the reform of the institutions in order to give proper expression to that. So you had that fairness and principle of consent. That was a coherent intellectual construct for the peace deal. And then you had the three strands, as you say, you know, inside Northern Ireland, the east, west, and north, south. And I think, therefore, we were having to struggle through the negotiation. That is absolutely true. But there was, and I think this again is important for peace process, there was an intellectual coherence about what we were trying to get agreed. And I think that did help. And it particularly helped with someone like David Trimble, who, you know, was prepared to think of this in quite philosophical terms and intellectual terms even. I mean, I do think as well, just the sheer pressure of the fact that we were prepared relentlessly to just stay up through the night and keep going had its own impact. And although, you know, as you know, at several points during the course of that negotiation, the thing looked, we thought we'd lost it. I mean, ultimately, it was just an absolute determination to drive this thing through. That I think, you know, it's an interesting thing. In the end, we were both just sitting astride the coach, driving it so fast that people just, they came along with us. But I don't think it would have happened if the basis of it hadn't been essentially something that reasonable people could see was justified.